And at the title itself, I'm going to be talking about how one can find bounds for the number of periodic geodesics, find bounds for the error term in the Weyl law. And this term here for predominant sets of metrics will hopefully end up meaning for you for most metrics. We'll see if I can convince you. So the structure of the talk is going to be the following. First, I'm going to introduce what I mean every time that I say predominant. We are going to be working in the space of Riemannian metrics, which is infinite dimensional. If we were working in a space that's finite dimensional, predominant would be the same as full measure. And that's what I would like for you to be thinking of throughout the talk. Then I'm going to talk about how to count periodic geodesics. I'm going to explain which results are known and what is it that Jeff and I were able to prove. Then I'll do the same for counting Laplace eigenvalues. So we'll talk about the Weyl law and the error term in the Weyl law. In the fourth slide, I'm going to relate these two problems. I'm going to explain how we can control the volume of periodic trajectories or trajectories that come very close to the periodic. You can actually both count the number of periodic geodesics up to p and the number of Laplace eigenvalues below some number lambda. So these are the first 4 slides, and then in the last 3, I'm gonna explain what the main ideas behind the proof are, or mostly what are the main obstacles in the proof. So first, I'm gonna explain how to discretize the problem, and instead of thinking of the continuous flow, think of the Poincare map and try to understand how to control the volume of near periodic trajectories using the Poincare map associated with a closed trajectory. And then I'm going to explain how is it that we are going to be able to build a large set of metrics, a predominant set of metrics, for which we can control this volume of the set of near periodic geodesics. And if I have time in the last slide, what I'm going to discuss is how is it that we actually build these metric perturbations. This predominant set of metrics is built out of metric perturbations, and if I have the time, I'm going to explain how is it that we actually construct. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to start talking about what is a predominant set. So we are going to be working in the space of all Riemannian metrics. It sits inside a Banach space, the space of all metric 2 tensors. So you have a linear structure there. The problem is that this space is infinite dimensional. So you ask, what does it mean to have a measure there? How can I introduce a notion of what it means to measure things in the space of all Riemannian metrics? And there are ways in which you can do this. If you're working just on a Banach space, you can rely on the linear structure and introduce what's called prevalence. And this is a notion that's akin to full measure for infinite dimensional Banach spaces. It was used by Galkowski and Hahn in order to understand how diffeomorphisms, for example, from the unit interval to the unit interval behave. The problem is that the space of all Riemannian metrics is an open subset of a Banach space, so you cannot actually use a concept that relies on the linear structure of the Banach space because you basically fall out. So this notion of predominance that I'm about to use is a generalization of this concept of prevalence that's actually well understood. So here we go. I'm going to introduce what it means to be predominant. If you have an open subset of Banach space, I'm going to say that the set G is going to be predominant if you can do the following. Suppose this is your Banach space, so here's the unit square. This is your Banach space right now. And what you need to be able to do is, if you want to claim that this set is predominant, you need to be able to associate to each point in your Banach space, in your open subset of the Banach space, as a manifold. So this is the point G, and you associate to it as a manifold LG. And you need to be able to do this to each point. So you end up building this foliation of the unit square. What each of these needs to satisfy is that whenever you intersect them with the set that you're interested in claiming is predominant, this intersection has to have full measure. for the set that we end up building, that's going to be predominant. These submanifolds are going to be infinite dimensional. Now, you have to be careful when you're making this definition because there is an example by Milnor on the unit square where he builds a foliation where this map is just continuous. The map that to each point associates the leaf. And what Milnor does was also build a subset E of the square that satisfies that whenever you intersect E with each of these leaves, this intersection has at most one point, and this set E has full measure. So you have this foliation that doesn't capture a full measure set. And this would be bad for us, right? Like we want to claim that predominance is akin to having full measure. So what you really need to do in order to avoid a case like this is to make sure that your map is not just continuous. It turns out that if you're asked for your map to be C1, then this cannot happen. If this map were C1, then the intersection with each of the leaves would have full measure here. In the example that Milnor builds, actually, each of the leaves themselves, they are real analytic. So it's quite a nice foliation. It's just that this map is continuous, and that turns out to not be enough to capture full measure sets. The other condition that we are going to ask when you're building this foliation is that for every metric G, every Riemannian metric G, the measure associated with the manifold running through G needs to detect a positive measure in a neighborhood of G. This is just so that the way in which you are measuring full measure has no holes in your space. You want to assign a positive measure around each point so that you're not missing any. So again,
the neighborhood is on the V.
Yes. So you have a submanifold, you have a Borel measure mu associated to the submanifold, and this neighborhood is inside the submanifold. Yes. So I realized that if you're not familiar with the notion of prevalence that I was talking about before, this may not sound very intuitive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you some properties that predominant sets have in the hopes that you actually believe that this is useful. So the first one is that predominant sets are always dense. So from now on, if you do not like the word predominant, in all the statements that I'm gonna be making from now on, you can just substitute the word predominant, switch it by dense, and then you would be comfortable because you know what I mean every single time. Now, predominant sets are much more than dense. You can grab two predominant sets, and the intersection is gonna be predominant. So they are bigger, and they are also much more in the sense that, from a measure theory point of view, if the boundary space you were working on was finite dimensional, then being predominant implies having full measure. So in finite dimensions, being predominant is having full measure. That's how you can think of it. But again, if you're not
equivalent in the finite dimensions or not?
Maybe that predominant is a bit stronger. We are not sure. Yeah. We tried proving that, but we didn't spend that much time, to be honest. But maybe that's slightly stronger. Okay, but in any case, if you're not comfortable with the word predominant, just switch it by dense. It's still, the entire presentation is still interesting in that setup. Okay, so let me talk about counting periodic geodesics now. We are going to work on a compact manifold with no boundary. And what we are going to do is we are going to count the number of periodic geodesics up to some length t. The function that's going to be doing the counting is this function here in red. So you give two parameters, the metric and t. T is the length of the geodesics that you're looking at. And what we are doing is we are counting primitive periodic geodesics for the metric g of length up to t. So by primitive, what I mean is that the geodesic is only allowed to go once about its trace. You're not counting here geodesics that are wrapping around several times. Those are excluded from this count. And just so that you are aware, this function may not be very well behaved. For example, think of the round sphere, and now look at all the geodesics of length 2 pi or more, then this function is infinite for the round metric. So it may not even give you back a number. Now there are several geometric setups in which it does. So for example, if you're working on negative curvature, it's a result by Baire-generic from 1969 that this function is going to grow exponentially in t, exponentially in the length of the geodesic that you're looking at. This constant here in front of the t, this h, is the topological entropy for the dynamical system given by the measure g for the geodesic flow. And then there are a few other results that generalize this one. For example, Bowen, 1972, proved that if you're working actually with axiom A flows, then the growth of this function is also going to be exponentially t. So this here just means there are two constants, C1 and C2, such that the bound is bounded below and above by the same exponential times those constants. So in particular, whenever you have a metric whose geodesic flow is an also, then the growth of the function is going to be exponential. And slightly more general too, there is a result by Niebert, 1998, where it was also proved that the growth is exponential. I wrote here for many G with non-positive curvature. These are like really the result is for rank 1 metrics. So rank 1 metrics are metrics who have that have non-positive curvature and are rank 1 GOS. Now, so one would ask, okay, so I know that here this function is quite well behaved. On the sphere, however, as soon as you reach 2 pi, it blows up. How bad can the function be? And Keith Burns and Gabriel Badermine in 1995 proved that actually on the round sphere, if you give me a function f of t, then arbitrarily close to the round metric of the sphere, they could find a metric, which here I'm denoting by GF, such that the geodesic count for that metric that they found is going to be always bounded below by the function that you prescribe. So the geodesic count can be really badly behaved, even when it's not infinite.
So what are the pointers? You choose F, and then you can construct the metric that for all t is true.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Exactly like that. All right, so one may ask, okay, this function is not very well behaved. When is it that I can control it? Or what happens at least for most metrics? What can we say? And it depends on what you mean by most, but some results are known. For Baire-generic metrics, the bumping theorem by Abraham and Amstov, what it shows is what it yields is that the number of periodic geodesics of left up to t is going to be finite for all t. So from a topological point of view, within the space of Riemannian metrics, for almost all metrics, you have that this function is going to be finite. And actually, Hinson in '84 proved that the function, as a function of t, is going to go to infinity for a Baire-generic set of metrics. But now, I mean, this is when I remind you that being Baire-generic from a measure theory point of view may not mean much. Like there are Baire-generic sets that have only measure theorem. So from a measure theory point of view, one may ask, okay, what happens with most metrics? Can I actually say that this function is going to go to infinity? And there is this beautiful result by Gonzalo Contreras from 2010 that says that this function is going to be bounded below by an exponential for an open and dense set of metrics. So this definitely holds for most metrics from a measure theory point of view. And not only that, but this bound is going to be sharp because you know that the growth is exponential for metrics with negative curvature. You're saying that now this bound holds for an open and dense set of metrics, so it has to be sharp. Now, in terms of upper bounds for this function, for most metrics, we couldn't find any results in the literature, and what we were able to prove with Jeff Galkowski is that there will be an upper bound that's going to be exponential. It's a stretched exponential, really. So let me read the result to you. So if you're working on a manifold, you need to be able to differentiate 5 times to do this. Then there will be a constant, this omega nu, and we can compute it explicitly. I'm just not writing it here because it's far from optimal. It's not pretty, but it only depends on your choice of differentiability, on your choice of nu, and on the dimension of the manifold. And so there exists this constant such that for any omega that you choose above that threshold, we can find for you a predominant set of metrics such that for every metric in that set, there will be a constant that makes the upper bound this stretched exponential upper bound true. So the number of primitive closed geodesic up to length t is bounded above by that constant that depends on the choice of metric that you're making, times e to the constant times t to the omega. We believe that if we had been smarter, we would have been able to actually choose this omega nu independent on nu. Like we believe it should be like 1 plus epsilon, any epsilon. But the truth is that our current methods don't allow us to go anywhere close to that. But that's what we believe should be the truth.
Do you have it for nu that goes to infinity or something?
So far, right now, when nu goes to infinity, this bound, this omega nu that we find is going to infinity.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So actually, if you want this result to hold for C infinity metrics, we no longer get a stretch exponential here. You can put here any function that grows faster than a polynomial. Not a polynomial. Yeah, and it weakens.
Does analyticity have?
Sorry?
Does analyticity?
We don't know. We don't know if it would help. We didn't think about it much. And after thinking about it, we didn't get to any conclusion. That's the trick. Yeah. Yeah.
So as the metric becomes more regular, the number of geodesics becomes more. Why is that?
My bound becomes worse. I don't know if the number of geodesics grows. Like the lower bound for the number of geodesics is always the exponential one. It's just that the way I can control it from above gets worse and worse. I get weaker. It's not.
I thought having more derivatives usually helps.
Oh yeah, but the problem is that our method of proof relies on making perturbations that are supported in very small neighborhoods, and these neighborhoods depend on the radii of these neighborhoods will depend on the level of differentiability that we are requiring. The more differentiability we need, the smaller the radii of these points are, and that makes this bound worse. We really think it's just our approach and not the reality. Yeah.
So can't you just forget that you have more derivatives?
Well, but the problem is
it wasn't the assumption and then the result, right? So you're losing some sort of.
Because the predominant set
Yeah.
of metrics that I'm asking, that I'm finding, is within the set.
So it's on both sides. So you
Why
can, you
cannot
can,
do that?
but
Yeah, that would be, yeah, fine.
can I ask another question?
Yeah, absolutely.
So as stochastic metrics in your predominant set. So what I mean by this is, like, well, basically the ones from stochastic homogenization. So if you take a grid, if you make a metric, somehow with bumps on a given grid, and you take all of such and like I would say all of grids, then is that within your predominant set?
I don't know. I don't know.
So who are your enemies in a sense? Like what's the definition of an enemy? I mean, presumably you are sort of proven that.
I'm gonna get to that, but my enemies are those metrics that have too many closed geodesics that I cannot perturb. Yeah.
Yes, it would be interesting. I mean, like obviously almost surely or something, because I'm assuming that there is one enemy among those which we all know. But maybe almost surely it's actually within your set.
Like if the geodesics start wrapping around and like near periodic for longer and longer times for my metric, then those are bad. Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so I'm gonna now present you with a slide that's like this one, but now for the Weyl. So we are working again on a compact manifold. We have boundary. The dimension of the manifold now is n. And the manifold is compact, so the spectrum of the Laplacian is discrete. We order them in increasing order. So I'm working with minus the Laplacian, all the eigenvalues are positive. And I'm denoting them by lambda j squared. And just in case you're not familiar with this terminology, whenever I say the word frequency, I'm referring to lambda j, not lambda j squared. So what the Baire law says is that if you're counting the number of frequencies below a number lambda, then this is going to grow like lambda to the dimension of the manifold. That's its lambda to the n here. And the factor in front of it depends only on the volume of your manifold and on the dimension of it. So here you have the volume of the unit ball in Rn divided by 2 pi to the n. So the number of frequencies up to lambda grows like lambda to the n, and there is this error there. So working on planar domains, I'll prove that this was indeed an error term, a little low of lambda to the n. But actually what's known, and this is due to Lebesgue and Anamovic, as Stefan was explaining yesterday, is that this error term in general is like big O of lambda to the n plus n minus 1. So what this means is that there exists a constant such that the error term is bounded above by that constant times lambda to the n minus 1 as lambda goes to infinity. Now this upper bound is separated on the Rand sphere. And actually there is this work by Westermann and Guillemin from 1975 that shows that the bound is sharp also, and that can be tested on any solved manifold. So aside from the Rand sphere, you have this classic manifold. The bound is also saturated. And in the same work, Westermann and Guillemin actually proved that the error term can be improved to a little low of lambda to the n minus 1 if you ask for the geodesic flow to be aperiodic. So what that means is that if you look at the set of all the directions that generate a geodesic trajectory that's going to end up being closed geodesic loop, that set of directions has to have measures 0. If you ask for that, then the geodesic flow is said to be aperiodic, and then they can improve this big O upper bound to a little low one. And in terms of quantitative improvements, Stefan was also mentioning yesterday, one can improve this to 1 over log lambda if you ask for the metrics to have no conjugate points. So this result is due to a combination of the work of Baire from 1977 and recent work of Contreras from 2017. So Baire first proved it for manifolds of negative curvature, any dimension, and for surfaces with no conjugate points. And then Contreras actually strengthened one of the estimates and was able to get the same result but for manifolds of any dimension with no conjugate points. So again, here the question is, what's the truth for most metrics? So you have these pathological examples that are saturating the upper bound. Usually what's going on there is that you have many symmetries that are making the multiplicities of the eigenvalues grow fast. And that makes the number of eigenvalues given some threshold grow the fastest they can, and so this error term is saturated. But if you step away from those like for most metrics, how much can one improve this error term? Many people believe that one should get polynomial improvements for this error term. Stefan had even a stronger conjecture. I don't know what I believe. But what's known is that, for example, if you're working on a Baire-generic set of metrics, if you combine the boundary metrics theorem by Abraham and Anosov, and together with the work of Doister and Guillemin, you will get that for a Baire-generic set of metrics, the error term is going to be low. This is simply because in the previous slide, I showed you that a consequence of the boundary metric theorem was that the counting function for the number of geodesics, closed geodesics of length up to t, was finite for a Baire-generic set of metrics. What that implies is that then the volume of trajectories that are going to be end up being closed is going to be 0. And that means that then they are going to be aperiodic in the sense of Doister and Guillemin. So you get the low improvement for a Baire-generic set of metrics. Again, Baire-generic is not most from a metric theory point of view. What we were able to prove with Jeff Galkowski is that we can find a predominant set of metrics for which you will get a quantitative improvement on the bound that's logarithm of lambda to the power of 1 over omega. So let me again read the statement here. So now we need a lot of differentiability and we don't have a clue how much. So there is this constant nu 0, which if we were to track it through the group, it would likely be a multiple of the dimension of the manifold. But we are not sure. Such that if your manifold is differentiable enough, then there will be a constant, and this is the same one as in the previous slide, it's the same omega nu, such that for any number above that threshold, we can find a predominant set of metrics that are C nu, such that for every metric there, the error term in the Weyl law is going to be bounded above by a constant times lambda to the n minus 1 divided by log lambda to the power of 1 over omega. So this would be, if this omega nu, we could bring it all the way to 1 plus epsilon, this would be log lambda to the 1 minus epsilon. That would be the best we could get, but we are far from that right now.
So for smooth manifolds, again, you don't know, or you have to?
No, for smooth manifolds, I can get here anything that grows slower than a power of a logarithm. I cannot
So
put a
you have a
polynomial.
quantitative bound, but it's worse than.
It's just lame, yeah. And
No,
I
but
think
it's better than that.
so yeah, it's better than nothing. But
I see.
yeah. Okay, so in the next slide, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna relate the two results for you. I'm gonna explain how counting Laplace eigenvalues is actually related to counting the number of closed geodesics up to some length. So this was the result that I showed you 2 slides ago, that for a predominant, we can find a predominant set of metrics such that there is a stretch exponential bound on the number of closed loops of length up to t. And what this result actually relies on is improving the following. If you give me an epsilon, it needs to be small enough, but if you give me an epsilon, then we are able to show that there exists a predominant set of metrics for which the volume of the set of directions. So these rows here are from now on. Rho is a point in the co-sphere bundle. So in phase space, they have length 1. So what one needs to be able to show is that the volume of the set of directions that generate a loop that comes epsilon close to being periodic. So that's what this means. So here we are applying the geodesic flow to rho, and then the trajectory for some time t smaller than the length that you're integrating comes back to being epsilon close to the rho where you started. So you are epsilon near being periodic. And again, this is in phase space, so you are aligning both position and velocity and momentum. If you can prove that the set of such directions is going to be controlled by epsilon to the power of 2n minus 2. And this power is important. You cannot get anything worse than that. Times a stretched exponential, then this result implies this one. The result for that is that in the same way that the bounding metrics theorem shows that the number of closed geodesics of length up to t is going to be finite for a Baire-generic set of metrics, we can prove quite easily that for a predominant set of metrics, the number is going to be finite here. And then once you know that you have finitely many geodesics for your system, you can, up to length t again, you can cover them with tubes of radius say delta. Then the volume of each of these tubes is going to be bounded below by delta to this power here, 2n minus 2. So you have all your closed geodesics up to length t covered by a tube of radius delta. You have a lower bound for each of these tubes. And what this volume bound actually allows you to do is to give an upper bound for the union of all those tubes combined. And so if you have a lower bound for each of your tubes and you have an upper bound for union of all the tubes combined, that ends up giving you an upper bound on the number of tubes that you end up having.
Is most geodesics supposed to be condensed? That's something that
no, because I mean, once you know that you're going up to, they are becoming dense and dense, yes, as t goes to bit. But I'm fixing t. And then I know that I have finitely many. So then I can choose a delta such that all the tubes are withdrawn. And then it works. Yeah. All right. So what are the eigenvalues? So the result for the eigenvalues is that we can find a predominant set of metrics such that the error term is improved by this power of a logarithm. And this boils down to two results. To explain the first one, I need to introduce the following concept of what it means for us for a metric to be T of R aperiodic. So T of R, the function that's going to be decreasing and actual, and it needs to be controllable for us by logarithm of R inverse. So for the purposes of the next two clicks, you can think of this as an equal to logarithm of R inverse. And we are going to be interested in like understanding what happens with geodesics of length up to T of R when R is going to 0. So basically, what it means to be T of R aperiodic is that if you start with a direction for which the following happens, you have a ball of radius R around that direction, and then you propagate it under the flow for some time t, and that ball comes back to intersect a ball of radius R around the point where you started. So you start here, you have a ball of radius R. You propagate it under the geodesic flow, and then there is some time t that's smaller than logarithm of R inverse for which you came back to intersect the original ball. So this is like coming R close to being R periodic if you want. Then what I need is that if you're one of those directions that are coming close to being periodic, then the volume needs to be controlled, the volume of all such directions, by a constant divided by T of R. And this needs to be true as R goes to 0. So if you were to choose logarithm of R inverse, the volume needs to at most grow like constant divided by logarithm of R inverse. So it has to go to 0 and in a controlled way.
So if the set with an epsilon, if I replace the epsilon inside with QR, how different is that set from this?
Good question. I'm going to talk about that in a second. This result implies this. Yeah. But let me now explain why. So when we introduced this concept of being T of R periodic, what we proved, this was 2 years ago, again with Galkowski, is that if the metric that you're working with is T of R periodic, then you get a T of 1 over lambda gain in the Weyl law. So in particular, if you choose P of R to be equal to logarithm of R inverse, what you would get here is a log lambda gain in the variable, which is what you get when you have no conjugate points. And that's one of the examples in which we can show that the manifold is log R inverse aperiodic. We can also show it for non-trivial products of manifolds. And there is work by Weyl where he actually develops these examples of surfaces of revolution that are analytic but are not solved, in which one can actually check that they are also going to be T of R aperiodic, and you get a log lambda improvement as well. Now, checking this condition is not the easiest. So after we wrote this paper, we asked ourselves, and this is actually what started this entire project, can we show that most metrics are going to be T of R aperiodic so that we can get a gain? And that's what we proved. So we actually show that if you choose T of R to be logarithm of R inverse and now the power of 1 over omega, then the manifold is going to be T of R aperiodic for a predominant set of metrics. And because the function that we can prove this condition for is weaker than logarithm of R inverse, we get this weaker result here. And as I was saying a second ago, actually proving that the manifold is T of R aperiodic for a predominant set of metrics amounts to proving this bound here. So really, it is true that for if you can control the volume of the set of directions that come epsilon close to being periodic, and that's controlled by epsilon to the power of 2n minus 2 times the stretch exponential in T, then you're good to go. So what the rest of the talk is about is explaining how is it that we are able to show that for a predominant set of metrics, one can get, one can control the volume of the set of trajectories that are near being periodic. How are we doing? Are there questions at this point? Okay. So suppose now you're working with a geodesic that flows. And here it's where I'm going to start hiding things from here so that the presentation becomes easier. But from now on, I'm only going to focus on geodesics that are closed rather than being very close to being closed, because that introduces several technicalities, in particular the existence of a Contreras section and a Contreras map. That's well defined associated to that. So let me preface by that. Let me actually now introduce this notation. So you give me a length of a geodesic, and I'm going to define the set of closed periodic geodesics of length comparable to that T that you chose. I'm going to grab one such geodesic, now they are closed, and you just pick a section that's transversal to the geodesic flow, and you can build, with respect to this section, what's called a Poincare map. So what the Poincare map does is it discretizes your problem in that you forget about what happens in between this time and the return time, and you only record the times in which you're hitting this transverse section. So the points at which you're here. So for example, the Poincare map associated to that point there, because the geodesic is closed, it's going to be the identity. It's going to give you the same point. But if I were to start somewhere else here, then you have to drag it under the geodesic flow, and the Poincare map would give you the return point. So you're trying to understand how close. So if I perturb this closed geodesic, if I move the metric a bit, and this geodesic is perturbed, can it break this periodicity with my perturbation? That's the main question that we are asking. We are going to be building perturbations of metrics so that the periodicity is broken. And what one of the things that you can do in order to understand that is to understand the differential of the Poincare map. So if I perturb my geodesic in the direction of this vector B, then that's going to create a new geodesic that's going to wrap around and come back. Whether this new geodesic is going to end up closing or not, it's something that you can measure using the linearized Poincare map, the differential of the Poincare map. If the differential of the Poincare map gives you the vector B itself, then this could be closing, and you are in trouble. What you want to do is to create perturbations for which the differential of the Poincare map, when you compare it to the identity operator, it's gonna, the identity minus the differential of the Poincare map is not gonna have a kernel. That's what you want. You want for this operator to be invertible. And actually, that's the content of the Baire-generic theorem. The Baire-generic theorem says that for a Baire-generic set of metrics, when you compare the identity operator against the differential of the Poincare map, this is invertible for a Baire-generic set of metrics. That's what the Baire-generic theorem says. What we prove with Galkowski is that for a predominant set of metrics, not only this difference is going to be invertible, but we can also control its size, which we need in order to understand the volume of the set of near periodic trajectories. So basically, we are building this set of metrics for which we can always avoid this difference having a kernel, and for which we can actually control how far away from that it's gonna be. Okay, so what I'm gonna do in the next slide is actually explain how is it that one could, or what are the main problems that one faces when it's trying to construct perturbations in the space of metrics that are generating this large family of metrics for which this difference of operators is actually invertible. So the method of proof that we have is by induction. What we want to show is that starting with a metric G naught, we want to find a metric G infinity, but this is what we find at the end of the process, such that you have this stretch exponential bounding the size of the inverse of the identity minus the differential of the Poincare map for every curve gamma that's closed and whose length is comparable to T. So suppose you know that you have a metric, you already were able to build a metric GL such that this bound holds. Now for every closed curve gamma whose length is comparable to 2 to the J, where you allow J to go all the way up to L. So my induction is gonna be on the length of the geodesics. And I'm gonna look at first geodesic of length 2, then 2 squared, and so on. So now I'm looking at geodesics of length 2 to the L, comparable to 2 to the L. And suppose you were able to arrange for a metric that's a perturbation of your original one, such that this one holds. So then what you want to do is to find the next metric, the next perturbation, perturb it a little bit, to get GL plus 1, such that this one now holds, but now for all closed geodesics of length 2 to the J, where you're allowing J to go all the way up to L plus 1 now. When you're doing that, there is one thing that's actually easy to arrange, which is given the metric GL, you can build the metric GL plus 1, such that this one actually holds for all closed geodesics of length 2 to the L, up to compared to 2 to the L for the new metric. This is simply because you know that this one held for the metric GL for all closed geodesics of length up to 2 to the L. And now if you just impose that this perturbation needs to be close enough to the metric G to GL, then the same bound is gonna hold. This is just a perturbation. If the two metrics are close enough, the bound is preserved as long as you're looking at the same set of geodesics of length up to 2 to the L. So the problem now is like, okay, how do you deal with the metric, those closed geodesics of length 2 to the L plus 1? And it turns out that what we can do is to actually build a metric perturbation. This is GL plus 1. And we build it by hand using the methods developed by Anoso in the bumping metric theorem, and Kinenberg in his note. I think the notes are called lectures on closed geodesics. And they explain how to perturb metrics to get to different goals. And we adapt one of those ideas in order to actually be able to arrange for this difference to be invertible and actually keep track of how invertible it is. Only when the geodesic that you're looking at is primitive. The reason for this is because if you have a geodesic that wraps around more than once and you do a metric perturbation, it's very hard to keep track of how that metric perturbation, if it is supported near that geodesic, will affect the behavior of this geodesic that's wrapping several times. But if the geodesic is primitive, if it only wraps one, then we can keep track of what happens with it, and we can tell you if it actually closes or not, and how close it becomes close. So now the problem is, and here's where the main subject of the entire project lies. And it is that now you need to understand how to deal with geodesics that are not primitive, but are still close and have length 2 to the n plus 1. Those you haven't addressed. And one would wish to say, okay, actually, I know that if I have a geodesic that's not primitive, so it wraps around itself several times, it's gonna be an iterate of a primitive geodesic, and perhaps I can use the inductive hypothesis on that and recover what I want. That's not true. And I'm gonna explain now in 2 lines why it's not true, that you actually can get away with this. So if you start with a geodesic that's close and has length comparable to 2 to the n plus 1, then it's gonna be the case iterate of a primitive geodesic. Let's call it beta. And what happens at the level of the Poincare maps, of course, is that then the gamma Poincare map is gonna be the case iterate of the beta Poincare map. And the issue with this is that the differential of the Poincare map is a symplectic matrix. And symplectic matrices may have eigenvalues in the unit circle. And even worse, if those eigenvalues have multiplicity that's odd, there's no way you can perturb them so that all your eigenvalues are going to end up outside the unit circle. And the problem with this is that now, if the beta linearized Poincare map you had an eigenvalue that's a case root of unity, then that means that you have a vector in the kernel of the identity minus the case iterate of the Poincare map, beta Poincare map, which in turn gives you a vector in the kernel for your gamma Poincare map minus the identity. So this is bad because I'm telling you now that this I cannot arrange for these perturbations to break things. What we can do, and this is how we deal with this, is to actually show that at each step, when I'm building the metric GL plus 1, the differential of the Poincare map for my closed geodesic gamma is not going to be close to the set of symplectic matrices that have an eigenvalue that's a K root of unity. Where K now, I'm only interested in K growing up to some constant that only depends on the length of the geodesic. Like the roots of unity end up being dense. So if I weren't imposing this up around here, we would be in trouble. But turns out that if you're dealing with geodesics of length up to the n plus 1, then you're only interested in roots of unities for which K is controlled by a number that depends on unit M. And then what happens is that at each step of induction, actually, what we can show is that among our perturbations, most of them are going to give you metrics that are going to be away from the set of symplectic matrices with a root of unity. And so this is how we actually end up building the set of predominant metrics for which this bound will end up holding. Okay, that's 50 minutes. So I'm gonna stop there. Thank you so much.
Very much, Benjamin. Questions, comments?
Stupid question. Explain us just how you destroyed the almost closed geodesics. Is it easy to understand that you don't create new ones that are?
Actually, yes, that's not the hardest part. And the creation of new ones, it's not what the main issue is. The main problem really was in controlling this distance to the set of symplectic matrices of unity. That ended up being harder than we initially thought. Yeah, we use there is this version of Sartre's theorem that's used to Yongdin. That's a quantitative version of Sartre's theorem that allows us to actually show that for most of our perturbations, I'm gonna stay away in a quantitative manner from this set. Yeah, I would say that was the hardest part. Yes.
You have some in your theory, you have mu like to phi. So in some of your theory, so mu like to phi. So how do the phi play the role in your argument?
Are you talking about the regularity?
Yeah.
So when I'm building the perturbations of the metric, and there is this one particular lemma in which I need to differentiate 5 times. But we didn't try hard to prove it. There is like we both think that perhaps we could have used more the structure of the geodesic flow to actually bring it down to 3. But we didn't try. We weren't pushing. We were just like any result is gonna be good, so let's just keep at it, and we weren't encouraged. Yeah, that's
Do you have a local version of this result for the spectral function?
that. Yeah, we want to do that in order to say that for most eigenfunctions, one can get a
Right.
variable.
Yes.
It's far away from the streams, but
Well, actually, sort of, I think that maybe the next step, but a much bigger one in a way, and the bigger one would be the following. So in the sense, for like since Baire-generic work, essentially all these techniques, they rely on the following ideas. So you take a geodesic, and you look at the parametric expansion, so you get the main term, you get the error, and then there are all these kind of counting issues. Because you sort of just estimate the whole error by just summing up the errors coming from each geodesic. So the next big step should be to understand the cancellation when you take the sums of these error terms. That probably involves the use of mixing or some more delicate properties of the geodesic. So do you think this is something that will be seen in the next few years, or what's your take on that?
I hope so. So I ended up working in this project. So when I was a graduate student, I was working like I was trying to understand how eigenfunctions and eigenvalues would react to random perturbations of a metric for the same goal. And at that time, I was super frustrated that I wasn't getting anywhere. And then Steve Selvidge told me that my problem was that the project wasn't a project for 1 or 2 years, that I should actually build my career around it. And this is the closest that I got to actually getting there. So perhaps like in 10 more years, I can get where you want.
All right, so thanks, Yaiza.